Good evening. Can I encourage everyone to please find a seat? Good evening and welcome to the National Humanities Center. I'm Robert Newman, I'm the president and director of the center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first in our public lecture series for 2016-2017. I want to mention and acknowledge that Flyleaf Bookstore from Chapel Hill is here with us, and they are selling Bill's books in the background. You can probably persuade him to write something, to inscribe something really warm and generous to you at the end. But it is my great privilege to introduce Professor William R. Ferris, who is a prolific author, an anthropologist, a folklorist, a filmmaker, an educator, a photographer, an academic administrator, whose work has contributed significantly to global understanding of the American South and cultural diversity. Bill has been called Southern culture's chief documentarian. After earning degrees at Davidson and Penn, Bill Ferris taught at Jackson State, Yale, and University of Mississippi, where he was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. And under his leadership, the University of Mississippi developed the most comprehensive Southern Studies curriculum in the country. And the center attained national recognition as a model for regional studies centers. In 1997, he was confirmed as the 7th chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities under President Bill Clinton, a role in which he served with distinction during a very troubled time for the humanities until 2001. After leaving the NEH, Bill settled in Chapel Hill, where he is now the Joe R. Williamson Eminent Professor of History at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, Associate Director of the Center for the Study of the American South, and an adjunct professor in the curriculum and folklore. The volume and breadth of his work is truly astounding. He's the author of 10 books and co-editor of the 1,656-page Pulitzer Prize-nominated Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, an exhaustive reference work covering everything from Hank Aaron and air conditioning to kudzu and zydeco. Bill has produced 15 documentary films, most of which deal with African American music and other folklore in the Mississippi Delta. And for many years, he hosted a weekly radio show about the blues, Highway 61, for Mississippi Public Radio. He was a consultant on the Hollywood films, The Color Purple, based on Alice Walker's novel, and Crossroads, which was inspired by the life of blues legend Robert Johnson. In 1998, he was honored by the Blues Hall of Fame, which recognized his book, Blues from the Delta, as one of the classics of blues literature. He is the recipient of numerous awards as well, including the Charles Frankel Prize in the Humanities, named for our center's first director, and Francis Chevalier, an officer in the Order of Arts and Letters. Bill started his career as a documentarian at the age of 12, when his parents gave him a Kodak Brandy Hawkeye, and he began taking photographs in and around Vicksburg, Mississippi. His first project with that camera, he took 2 sets of pictures. One of the Christmas table at his grandmother's house, the other of the baptism of an African-American baby. And his bridging of cultures has been an enduring theme in all of his work. Photos in the current exhibit were published in 2013 in Bill's book, The Storied South, as the second installment in a documentary trilogy about the South in the 20th century. The first book in the series, Give My Poor Heart Ease, took as its subject the blues and blues musicians, and the newest installment, out this month from UNC Press, is The South in Color. His photos have been featured in national publications like the New York Times, and in museums and galleries across the country, from the Smithsonian to most recently the Levine Museum of the New South, and now, of course, grace the walls of the National Humanities Center. We're so honored to have him here. 4 of the subjects in Bill's photographs here at the center have been walking these halls before. Legendary literary scholar Cleo Brooks was a fellow here in 1979, 1980, and again in 1980-81. Folk singer Pete Seeger visited and was a guest on the radio show Soundings in the mid-1990s. Eudora Welty visited and was also a guest on Soundings in the mid-1980s. And historian Vann Woodward was one of our trustees, whose involvement with the center extends back to its very first year in operation in 1978. I must also add that when Vicki and I moved to North Carolina last year, and I began to ask questions about who do I need to meet first, one of the most prominent names recommended to me was that of Bill Ferris, whose grace and charm are as legendary as his Rolodex. Over the past 15 months, he and his equally gracious and talented wife, Marcy, who herself is a prolific scholar dealing with food culture, have become not only wonderful friends, but an endless source of help in deepening the National Humanities Center commitment to public engagement in the state and in the nation. Please welcome Bill Ferris.
Thank you, Robert. It's such an honor to be here. I think of the National Humanities Center is really the epicenter for scholars of all ages who need a year to replenish their spirit and to create the next great book on the topics they write about. And one of the nicest things the center has done is bringing Vicki and Robert here. Marcy, my wife, and I cherish the friendship that we have with them, and we share so many things in common. I thought I would simply share with you tonight a few pieces from my earlier book, The Storied South. Without knowing it, I've been dealing with the South for many years, as Robert suggested, when I got that little camera at the age of 12 and started clicking. At some point, there was a click in which I realized I was no longer using the camera for family, but trying to somehow create a relationship to the place that produced me and you as well. And that led me to a career as a folklorist. I love the spoken word and aspired to be a writer, and realized after reading Faulkner that I would never, ever achieve anything like that genius. So I turned to folklore, and that has been a wonderful kind of nurturing career that led Marcy and me to the University of North Carolina, where we are deeply in love with this great state and with the people here. But along the way, there was no field called Southern Studies. I was an English student at Davidson, and I began to see, as I tried to document the South, that people had been there ahead of me, people who became my heroes and heroines. And I was privileged to meet many of those people and to be able to interview and photograph and film them. So my book, which I'm talking about tonight, and the photographs are from, is called The Storied South. And it essentially looks at all of these people who never were aware of themselves as Southern Studies scholars. They were simply writing a novel or a history of the South, or photographing, or painting. But after a period of time, they became the iconic voices to whom we turn when we look at the South. They are the building blocks for the field of Southern Studies. And at the University of North Carolina today, you can do the BA, MA, and PhD in Southern Studies as a track in the American Studies department. As you know, UNC is where the study of the South began in the 1920s with Howard Odom and Guy Johnson, who wrote and published through the UNC Press the first book ever published on the blues. John Hope Franklin published his first book there, and the Southern Historical Collection and the Southern Folklife Collection are the largest archives on the South in the world. So this really, for me, is like Vatican City for study of the South. So after doing my first book that Robert mentioned on blues, I thought I would look back on my work with these writers and artists and photographers and gather them into a single volume. They never knew each other, except for a few. And I thought I'll put them together at a common table of conversation, and the reader can share in an intimate way with their voices. And thanks to the UNC Press, there is a CD with all of their voices on it, and a DVD with films of many of them. And so I organized it, and I never think of a title until the book is done. And I couldn't figure a title for this book, and I was walking with Marcy one day and told her, I said, the only thing they share in common is they love to tell stories and to hear them. And she said, well, just call it the Storied South. And I began to think about that. It is, in a way, a key to the South. When we meet someone, we ask them, where are you from? The place is what grounds us as Southerners. And then the stories flow. In our family, we've heard the same stories every holiday, but we still want to hear them again because that is how we affirm who we are. So I began to think of the story as a key to how we understand the South. And this is how I open the book. The South is a land of talkers whose stories are as old as the region itself. We tell stories at home, on the street, in settings familiar to every Southerner. Our stories transport the listener, like a leaf turning on water, into another world. The story is the inescapable net that binds Southerners together. Southern writers translate the story into fiction. Scholars use story to explain the region's history. Musicians transform story into song. And photographers and painters capture story in images. Through storytelling, the South reveals its soul. As the people in this book talk about the South, they capture its story with their distinctive voices. Unlike the traditional folk storyteller, these speakers are formally educated and consciously choose the story to define their craft as artists and thinkers. They ground their identity in story. And gracing the cover of the book is one of the great storytellers who could tell a good tale and also weave it into her fiction, Eudora Welty. So I'm going to take you on a brief journey to meet a few of the people in this book whose photographs grace the halls of this beautiful center. So the Storied South is indeed a series of visits with writers and artists. It starts really with my work as a folklorist, trying to get a sense of direction and meaning out of the places in which I lived, trying to bridge the incredibly painful and enduring waters of race, the white and black issues that sadly continue to plague us today. It was my effort to reach into, as a privileged white, the worlds of black families whom I knew and begin to explore through music and storytelling those worlds along the roadside. What the French call la vie quotidienne is what I tried to aim my camera at. And it began on the front porch of country stores near my home on the farm where I grew up in rural Mississippi. Country stores run by people like Aiden White, who ran the Crossroads Country Store just off the Natchez Trace. And she told me the story of her father. He was the second of 3 generations to run that store, and how he had been murdered by a disgruntled customer. And as she and her mother took her father home, he looked at the wound and the blood running out of it and said to her, "Such a small hole for your life to run out of." There was also a little grocery store on the farm where I grew up, run by Mary Gordon. And at any moment, in any day of the year, there were people telling stories on the front porch. And those stories were my education. People like Robert Appleton, who told me how his ancestors walked from Natchez, Mississippi to that farm as slaves. And their descendants were the people who I knew as my teachers. So I took that as my foundation and tried to understand the writers like Eudora Welty and how they would build on the foundational voices of the region in their work. And it was a special privilege to know Eudora really from childhood. Her parents and my grandparents lived quite close to each other in Jackson. And she would visit the farm. She was, as you know, a gifted writer, but also a gifted photographer. And her photographs inform her fiction. And she would come to the farm with friends like Cleon Brooks. And they loved to share stories of their times together. When we dedicated the Faulkner postage stamp at the University of Mississippi, we invited Eudora and Cleon, who were dear, dear friends. Cleon and Robert Penn Warren had published Eudora's first 5 short stories in the Southern Review, and they had been fast friends since that time. Eudora, of course, read from her dramatic monologue, her short story, Why I Live at the P.O., and Cleon spoke about Faulkner's brief tenure as postmaster of Oxford. He was fired after 2 weeks, and when asked what the problem was, he replied, "I refuse to be at the beck and call of every son of a bitch who's got 2 cents and wants to buy a stamp." So Cleon and Eudora had a wonderful time reminiscing about their visits with Faulkner and his extraordinary body of work. They were close friends, as I mentioned, and I'm trying to get my slides to turn. There we go. And I also spent time with Eudora and her oldest friend, Charlotte Capers. Charlotte was an extraordinary storyteller, and Robert Penn Warren declared her the greatest short story or storyteller he had ever known. I brought Eudora to Yale, where she spent memorable hours with my students. And we were able to secure for both Eudora and B.B. King during my years there honorary doctorates of humane letters. And every time I would come back home to visit my family, I would call Eudora and we would get together. I would always bring a large bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon, which we would pour into 2 glasses and the stories would begin. Towards the end of her life, I called her, and her hearing was not as good as it had been. And I said, Eudora, I'd love to come see you tomorrow. Would that be all right? And she said, oh, that would be lovely. What time would you like to come? I said, would 10:30 be all right? She said, did you say 7:30? I said, no, 10:30. She said, oh, good. For a moment there, I thought you were testing our friendship.
I've had some students ask me, somebody said, Miss Welty, you always write stories about olden times. And I said, well, the stories you're talking about, I wrote, back in the 40s or something. That's because I was writing when those things were happening. I wasn't writing about mysterious hidden past. It was the present when I was writing about it. And so it was real and belonged in the story. Now the present reflects other things. But that's what happens in the world at the time, and you got to reflect that too. I do think that it's important to understand the reality, but not to obliterate what's gone before. In the interest of saying that nothing is real but the present.
When I taught at Jackson State, Alice Walker lived in Jackson, as did Eudora. And that was the time when Alice interviewed Eudora for the Radcliffe Review. It's a classic interview of 2 very different Southern writers. And Alice has been a dear friend since that time, and her work in The Color Purple truly unveils a world of women and Black experience in the American South.
I think I'm dealing with regions inside people. Although they are the people who are in the South. And in fact, I guess I really just leave it up to other people to decide. I mean, if they can only understand writing by placing it in a context, that's fine. I don't really quarrel with it. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm really trying to understand people and how they get to be the way they are. So the region is the mind and the heart, not the section.
When I was in Oxford, Alice came and spoke, and she visited Faulkner's home, Roanoke, and this is the study where he outlined one of his last novels. Ernest Gaines was a special friend whom I visited first in San Francisco, and he talked with me about the creation of his character, Miss Jane Pittman, who is one of the great figures in Southern fiction.
Of course, I don't think I could have done it had I not been born in Louisiana. I mean, I've been born in Arkansas, probably later in Arkansas, whatever you call it, in Arkansas, or Texas, Georgia, or whatever. But I happened to go to Louisiana, and she was gave a little Louisiana terms to use and dialect. It was, and when I was writing that book, after reading all this stuff that I read, I had to, let's say, put it into the mind of an illiterate who, with basic common sense, would not have the
Sterling Brown has always had a special affinity for what I love to think of as blues poetry. And I teach him both in my course on music and in my course on literature. And he expressed very vividly this field of contested memory in the study of the South. When Southerners say we lost the war, we say, well, some whites lost it, but blacks were liberated. So let's get it straight. There are different memories that have to be honored, and that's part of what this book seeks to do.
My wife is a thorough folklorist. She knows how to talk. And knows how he fucks up his family to get the wrong people in the wrong place. Because she identifies she came from a small town. You met one. She's a grandchild of slaves and compassionate white. And when he deals with these small towns, it takes her back to her small town. I take a lot of fault. Go down there, a little less Intruder in the Dust. Some of the short stories, great. Absalom, good novel. Light in August, he fucks up. All that goddamn split in Joe Christmas is the old tradition just made sophisticated. It's a lot of crap. I never am sure when he is Gavin Stevens and when he's not. But if he's Gavin Stevens in Light in August, he really messed up. Gavin Stevens is a little bit better in The Bear. The Bear is a great story, but The Bear is full of crap in the business about it. Well, all he really sees is they will endure, they will prevail, but not because of any of their own drive. Dulcie is just a woman of determination to hold the family together, but it's a white family. I'm concerned with what about her kids. And he is still, he cannot get over his anti-Yankeeism. And he can't get over the scenes on in Go Down Moses. The boy goes to Chicago and is immediately fucked up. Comes home, corpse comes home, you see. And all the damn illusions are, whenever he's on a Yankee, it's awful. So in Light in August, it's a Yankee woman having the dealings, It's the same kind of thing that Robert Penn puts in about Oberlin in the band. See, Oberlin was a wonderful school for Negroes, but he's got to belittle it. You see, the Yankees didn't care for niggas either, you see, it's that. And the Yankees didn't, by God, you at least could stand on your feet on the Yankees. If a Yankee called you some bitch, you could knock him in his goddamn head, and you would get lynched. You would get, and this whole foolishness that the nigga going north, if he goes knocks on the door for food, the white man shuts it in his face. And in the South, the white man says, what the hell are you doing in my front door? Come around back. And they go around back and gets a lot of eats. That's a lot of shit. That's a lot of crap. And I ain't got no illusions about it, no lack of prejudice. Boston is a bad goddamn place for Negroes. And I don't know about New Haven. They're bad. But that don't make Atlanta better. And that don't make Memphis better. And if I go down south to Talladega, I'm happy because I'm with my people. And we got a handful of white teachers there who are decent like you. But I don't know about the rest of the damn county around about it. See what I'm driving at? This thing is not simple, north and south. But it is not north versus south, one perfect and the other imperfect. No. But if I got to take my chances on violence and on insult, I'll take the north any day. Because if I get 10 miles out of Atlanta, I know what I run into. And I got plenty of folk on that.
Some of the people featured in the Storied South were not born in the South, but their lives were forever changed by coming to the region. Pete Seeger's father, Charles Seeger, brought him here first as a baby to Pinehurst, and then later as a teenager to Asheville, where he heard the banjo played by Samantha Baumgartner with a decorated front, which he later used on his own banjo. And he later took the black hymn, "We Will Overcome," and modified it with the words, "We shall overcome," and created the anthem of the civil rights movement in the South that has been a banner song for justice throughout the world. It was sung in Tiananmen Square. Wherever there are movements for peace and justice and civil rights, the spirit of Pete Seeger and of his family and his father, Charles Seeger, is alive and well. And his passion for music was shared by admirers all over the nation, and especially in the freedom movement in the American South.
I'm quite proud that two phrases I invented are now used by banjo pickers, and I think some guitar pickers all over the country. As you come down with your left hand and hit a note, you don't need to touch it with your right, you got a note. But usually you strike the same string first with your right hand. Wow, what a discovery. You get notes with your left hand as well as your right. And I invented that phrase, pulling off. My mother, violinist, said that's called left-hand pizzicato. And that I call pulling off.
Another visitor to the South, whose life was forever changed, was Walker Evans, who traveled to Hale County, Alabama, with James Agee, and his photographs and Agee's narrative created one of the great documents of documenting the South. And Evans remembered the passion of Agee and totally identified with him on that journey. And those photographs are considered the greatest in the career of the photographer that I would call America's greatest black and white photographer.
Well, he was very young, you must remember, and what he wanted to do was to shock and scare people, which is far from anything in the academic world. He wanted to make people who were not poor, for example, really feel what it was like to be up against it. And he wanted to rub it in, and he was angry. He wanted to say, look, you sons of bitches, you bastards, what the hell do you think you're doing living this way while these people are living this way? And the hell with you, I wish you all to go to hell, which is young and immature attitude, but he was that way. And as you remember, some of those pages in that book do try to rub it in that way. He was very angry about the middle class American society whose minds are conditioned by security and by taking things for granted. Whereas these people who were human beings whom he loved were shut out of that. Not only shut out of it, but suffering deeply because of being shut out of it. Just because of money, which is, as you and I know, really an evil thing. The social injustice is a shocking work of the devil somehow or other. And I still feel it today.
The artists, the visual artists, the painters are especially powerful in rendering story on canvas. Eddie Andrews grew up in a sharecropper's family in Georgia and became the head of visual arts at the National Endowment for the Arts. And stories of his life in the South imbued every one of his works of art.
We would work from sun up to sundown, and flat lands of cotton, just as far as you could see would be cotton. And it would be hot and things like that. And you'd be doing this repetitive thing. You'd be going from one end of a row to another that would be just unbelievably long. And you had to do something to keep your mind occupied. So I would look up at the clouds, and I got to a place where I could make pictures out of clouds. I'd be working, picking cotton, holding cotton, whatever I'd be doing, and I'd just be making pictures of it. And sometimes I'd just stop and draw in the sand and things like that. And at night when I go home, I would just draw some of those things I'd seen in the clouds. And even now I can look up and just make up whole illustrations across the sky. And that had to do again with that raw, austere thing of the divine.
Lord Gatewood, closer to home in Yanceyville, had a unique perspective on the South. Her home faced the square, and she said she could walk out the front door and be downtown and walk out the back door and be in the country. And her studio includes pieces of furniture made by Thomas Day. And her will, after her death, left her entire estate to UNC Greensboro. And her legacy as an artist and as a storyteller enriches generations of students and will continue to do so.
I was born in the house on the square, and 20 years later, when I was 20 years old, my father died, and the black woman who'd been there when I was born, took me aside that day and told me that I'd be all right, because she had supervised my afterbirth burial, and she described how she had taken my father and they'd gone to the fields. this was in January with frozen ground, and dug a hole 3 feet deep and buried the afterbirth with stones on it and so forth to have it absolutely safe and secure so my life would be good. And I found it later, it's primarily an African belief, the preservation or protection of the afterbirth. And I think much of our life in the South, the white life in the South, as well as the black, has its element of Africa and African thinking and belief. And of course, the most obvious is Uncle Remus stories, but many other small aspects. Africa's given us quite a bit in the South. And, I'm thankful for it.
So the stories continue, and driving around Jackson with Eudora, they flowed freely. Someone seeing these photographs said she shouldn't have been driving and telling stories at the same time. Well, you don't tell Eudora Welty what to do in her car. And when you think about it, no matter where we are in the course of the day, people are telling stories. And if we listen, we understand them, ourselves, and the places in which we live much more deeply and much more clearly. So that is the Storied South, and it's sort of my story. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you. Yes.
Coincidentally, I'm reading Dime Store by Lee Smith. I just started only about 2 chapters in. But the 2 themes that I took from what I read today, she talks about how her father had this dime store in Grundy, Virginia, and when it went out of business, it was the day that he died. I mean, he closed the store, went to the hospital, and passed, and the Army Corps of Engineers came in and they took care of the flooding, and the city fathers built this wonderful big Walmart there in town. So I think that's one theme that's covered about the changes in the South. The other theme is that her mother moved there from Chincoteague, and she told her daughter, "You got to get out of here. You got to get cultured." And Lee Smith said, actually, the culture of the South came to all of America, and she concentrated on the music, but she also was talking about all the other venues that have spread across America from the South. And I'd love to have you comment on that, please.
Well, that's beautiful. Mentioning the Walmart made me think of Lee Smith's new book, The Dime Store.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah. Change is so powerful, and people say, well, it's too bad things are changing. Well, they've always been changing. You can't step in the water twice in the Mississippi River. It's constantly moving. And we can't take a photograph of the same place twice in the same way, which is why photography, I think, is increasingly important. William Christenberry has been going back every year to photograph homes and landscape to try to follow the changes, the decay of people and buildings and places, and to somehow understand that. But the South is like kudzu. It reaches beyond the region. This afternoon, I was visiting with a group of colleagues from Jamaica. We're building a partnership between UNC and Jamaica that will focus on Trench Town, where the reggae musicians all lived. And one of the group was a producer, still is, of the music. And he said all of the reggae and Jamaican musicians modeled themselves on Southern blues and rhythm and blues. He mentioned Curtis Mayfield and others. So that the study of the South in many ways is a key to studying his culture. Excuse me. And that music has come back. I had a student who wrote a paper on a bluegrass group in western North Carolina called the Sons of Ralph. Ralph is a bluegrass musician in the traditional sense, but his sons are merging bluegrass with reggae in a very interesting way. So as we understand these worlds, the complexity and richness is quite powerful. And as you point out, Lee Smith has been doing that for so long. I teach Lee's work, oral history, and you can very clearly look at how she took a ballad, Darlin' Corey, that she listened to in the Southern Folklife collection, and rewrote it as Darlin' Dory in that novel, using the name of one of her main characters. So these writers and artists and storytellers really are a key to how we understand our region, and they're a key to solving some of our enduring problems of race, of gender, and class. And as Faulkner once said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And those old issues continue to haunt us. And if we're going to deal with those in a thoughtful, enduring way, we have to understand that history, which is exactly what Robert Newman is doing as the master of this ship of humanities at the National Humanities Council. This is a major resource, as those who created it understood, for North Carolina as well as for the nation. So we would be well served to harness it. And each of you understand that because of your support for the center. Education is the key, and this great institution is the heartbeat of where education needs to be headed. Yes, Walter. The question is there any difference between white stories and black stories in the South? Yes and no. They're all about place and about people and their connection. But as with the difference between country music and blues, there's a deep difference of roots in Africa and in the British Isles and Europe. So storytelling in the South, if we look at the history of that, we go back to animal tales that are derived from animal tales in Europe. In the white storytelling, we have in North Carolina the Jack tales. These are all trickster tales, but tricksters in Africa tend to be animals like the rabbit, and in the Caribbean, Anansi, the spider, which for some reason never came to this country. But Jack is a prototypical trickster from European traditions. So there are differences, but they're all deeply rooted in the place. I teach my students T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which works well with literature as well as folklore. And Eliot posits, as you know, there is the great tradition within which the artist works. So you have Faulkner working in the great tradition of the novel and looking backward to Joyce. But there's a third leg of the stool that I tell my students, which is place, a sense of place that Eudora Welty writes about. You cannot understand Faulkner and the novel without understanding Yoknapatawpha County, the mythic place in which he sets his fiction, any more than you can understand Ulysses apart from Ireland and Dublin. So there are differences, but they all operate in very similar ways. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts about Margaret Merritt as a storyteller in North Carolina, a mystery writer?
I'm embarrassed I don't know that work, but I need to.
Have you heard of her?
Yes.
She's written 20 books or so. She lives in Johnson County and writes mystery stories with North Carolina locales, various locales.
There are a lot of North Carolinians whose work I need to read more of. And I'm embarrassed. I'm going to correct that. When I go back, I'll get her books and start. There was a question in the back.
My area of academic research has been Irish studies, in particular Irish literature, and I kept hearing parallels between Irish tradition and what you were saying about the American South. The Irish are great storytellers, just ordinary people, as well as great writers, and the sense of place and the construction of identity out of stories, the contested memory, the nationalist history versus the revisionist, and the importance of folklore and Yeats and Robert Newman could probably comment on Joyce better in this regard, but I was just, given the huge influx of Irish immigrants to America, particularly the South, going back centuries, I'm sure it's just a lot of coincidence, but is it a mentality, or the storytelling is so important in Irish tradition as well?
Well, I didn't pay you to ask that question, but I'm grateful you did. That's a subject close to my heart. And I think the Irish are very important in understanding the American South. I've done an article on that. And one of my dreams is to create, maybe my swan song at UNC will be to create an Irish Studies Center that will look at the classic canon, as does our Jewish Studies Center, which we work with, of Irish studies, but will also look at the Irish and the South. And they've had an essential role here from the very beginning. Their influence on literature, on music, on history is absolutely critical. And so I think, and the storytelling, the gift of the gab, which the Irish have, is shared by Southerners. There is an instinctive kind of affinity. And I was drawn to Joyce as my hero when I was an undergraduate at Davidson. I read Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and it changed my life. I saw myself as angry and rebellious, and when Joyce wrote that Stephen Dedalus fled the nets of family, religion, and nation, patriotism, I would have added to that race, the racism of the South and its history. But the Irish are really a critical part of what we do, and UNC, to its credit, has within its great library, Wilson Library, one of the great collections of Irish writers, first editions, along with beatnik writers. There's a rich, rich history. Lawrence Ferlinghetti studied at UNC. So all of my loves are represented there, but the Irish especially. We have a number of writers and scholars at UNC and students. And Robert, of course, was saying earlier, he taught an entire course, a whole semester, on Ulysses. So I hear what you're saying. There was a question back here.
It's a statement.
Okay.
I was raised in the Methodist faith. My grandmother was from Edgecombe County. She was a primitive Baptist. And I tried to connect with that religion. I was unsuccessful. But along at the same time, they did a special on public radio where they sung some Irish songs and also the primitive Baptists. We could not tell apart.
Yes.
Where they carried the tunes, we could not tell apart.
Yes. Oscar Lewis is saying that the primitive Baptists and slave songs are so very similar. Frederick Douglass writes about visiting in Ireland and hearing the keening at the funerals and how similar it was with the hymns that he knew as a slave in the South. Ed Yoder.
Bill, that was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it very much. You probably know this story. I would say it's almost certain that you do, but it has to do with Eudora Welty, whom I had the privilege of knowing not terribly well, but through Peter Taylor and later Willie. I have heard, and I believe I read this piece, that on the night of the assassination of Medgar Evers, she sat down and wrote a brilliant and penetrating profile of the probable assassin without ever having had any personal identification of this loathsome figure. But I wonder how this, if you had any speculation about how this ties in with her very powerful gift for storytelling.
Well,
it's obvious at one level, but I'm sure you have a more sophisticated view.
Well, that's absolutely true. When she heard about Medgar Evers' assassination, she said, I know who did that, and I'm going to write about it. Not knowing literally, but in her imaginary vision, she created this character. And it was so close to Byron de la Beckwith that her publisher had to change a few details for legal reasons. But Eudora nailed it. And it was simply living in that world. She could instinctively know who that was and create a fictional character that was so close to the real assassin that it had to be modified for legal reasons.
I think it was in the New York.
Yes, it was. Yes. The last question.
Bill, I'm going to sneak in two questions. The second one, you've been asked a lot of times, but I'm really eager to hear your answer. First way is that people talk about my drinking, but they don't talk about my thirst. And secondly, when you think about the great writers that have come from the United States, what are the ingredients in what I'll call the Southeast that are not present in the Southwest, Northeast, or the Midwest? And is it good news or bad news that, or is it just a parochial view that the South seems to produce significantly more profound authors than the rest of the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think Southern culture, and when I was at NEH, my initiative was to create and support 10 regional humanities centers, which we did, the Southwest, the Midwest, and there are differences. The Great Plains Center at Lincoln, Nebraska is one of those. And when I was at the University of Mississippi, we invited John Shelton Reed to come speak, and to speak about sociology in the South. And I always remember that talk. He said, it's interesting that there are almost no sociologists in the South. There are lots of them in New York City. You throw a stone and you'll hit one. But in the South, you find writers, and in abundance. And this goes back to storytelling. We are a region of storytellers, and where you find the storytellers, you find the writers. In Nigeria, Amos Tutuola, Chinua Achebe, this is a land of great oral tradition. And so storytelling in the South is like a bedrock. You can predict that Ireland and the South will always produce great writers. So I think it's a cultural difference, and it's not a sense of one being better than the other, but there's a different way of thinking. And during Watergate, when Sam Irwin, thank you, when he was such an extraordinary figure, because when they would ask him a question, he would tell a story. And this is why Shelby Foote was such a powerful addition in Ken Burns' Civil War series. That's about history and facts. But you ask Shelby a question and you got a story. And ultimately, the great lawyers, and we have those with us tonight, the great teachers, the great writers, there is an elemental understanding of storytelling, because in order to argue and to create communication, the story does it by indirection. By indirection, you direction find with the story. And if someone asks you to talk about poverty in the South, you can give figures, how many people do and don't. But if you instead say, I want to tell you about this lady who's living in this home alone, and tell you her story, that touches the heart. And so that's a long way of answering that we have a different way of understanding history and of expressing ourselves that is bound at the hip with storytelling. Thank you all for a wonderful.
I would suggest that we adjourn to more informal conversation. We have refreshments here, but please join me again in thanking an absolutely wonderful man and wonderful storyteller,